Yeah, so I'm really excited to be presenting in this group. So MIA has been like a super important community to me, particularly in the beginning of grad school. Come every week. It was just a great place to learn about the new things at kind of the intersection of statistics, computer science, and biology. Yeah, and today I'm going to be talking about this new approach for high-dimensional hierarchical modeling. So to get started, linear models are super widely used across many different areas of science and social science to give interpretable summaries of complex phenomena. So for example, in statistical genetics, right, we commonly use linear models to relate differences in people's genomes to whether or not they develop diseases. In the context of protein design, which is something that I've been getting into more in this term as I've been visiting the Baker lab in Seattle. We might use linear models to relate the sequence composition of a protein or pairwise combinations of amino acids to the energy of folding or maybe some catalytic function of a protein. And then farther afield in the context of educational policy, yeah, we might want to relate educational interventions, say whether or not an after-school program is provided at a school to student success. And when data are noisy or the sample sizes are small, in many cases, identifying relationships in these situations can be challenging due to inferential uncertainty that leads to estimation error. And hierarchical Bayes provides a possible solution to this and promises that we can share strength across related groups of data. So for example, in the context of statistical genetics, as Hillary mentioned, we might want to do this for different diseases, perhaps some for which we have lots of power in big cohort sizes to learn about, ones for which we have smaller, maybe positive samples of cases. In the context of protein design, we may want to design proteins that are active under different conditions, say low pH or high temperature. And on the educational policy side, perhaps the effects of interventions that we're interested in can vary across different schools or different regions of the country. And this is, yeah, this idea of hierarchical modeling has been around for a long time. And there's kind of a standard classical approach that I'll get into in quite a bit of detail later on in this talk. And the problem is that this approach can fail in the high-dimensional setting, and in particular when the number of covariates in our regressions is larger than the number of groups. So to give a teaser of this, you can see that if we look at performance in simulation in terms of estimation error of different like approaches, if we use this classical approach that I'll describe soon, it performs really well in low-dimensional settings where we have a smaller number of covariates than we have different groups of data. But then as we move to the high-dimensional setting, it actually will perform worse than if we do a kind of comparable independent analysis where we only look at data from each group one at a time. So by contrast, in this talk, we show that a twist on this classical approach can be more accurate in high dimensions than independent analyses and do a good job of sharing strength. And although in the low dimensional setting, this actually will perform worse than the classical approaches and independent analyses, in the high dimensional setting, it does well. For the rest of this talk, I'll first start off with giving some background and notation on linear models, hierarchical and empirical Bayes, and going into multiple linear regression. After that, I'll talk about our proposal and our method, which is based on this idea of treating the effects in our regressions as a priori exchangeable across covariates. And this contrasts to the classical approach, which, as I'll explain, is grounded on this idea of a priori exchangeability among the groups. This has some connections to existing approaches in statistical genetics, in particular this idea of genetic correlation. So I'll go into that. And then next, in order to actually use this approach, we're going to have a way of doing inference. So the Bayesian model will have to do posterior inference. And this is going to require some new algorithms. then finally, I'll close with some validation, looking at performance in high dimensions, both with theory and empirics. And I'll also say that this talk is, I think, going to be a little bit on the shorter side. So please interrupt if you have questions along the way, or else as I get towards the end, I'm going to have to start speaking like really slowly to fill up the time. All right, so onto background and notation. So let's kind of dive further into this example in education, where we imagine we're interested in relating participation in an after-school program to academic performance. So in this case, we might have data where for each of a number of students in some school, where I'll index this student by n, going from 1 to big N as the number of students. And we could model like their change in academic performance, say using standardized tests as a proxy, as a sum of an effect of this after-school program beta modulated by this covariate indicating whether or not they were in the program, so either 0 or 1. And I'll denote that by x, plus some residual epsilon, which for this talk I'll be assuming is Gaussian distributed. And yeah, with this simple linear model, kind of straightforward way that we could imagine analyzing this data would be to use least squares to get an estimate. But here we're asking, what do we do if we have data from multiple schools? So for example, imagine we have one in Cambridge, another one in Somerville, and another one in Dallas. How do we proceed in this setting? So we can certainly accommodate this situation in our model and in our notation, right, by introducing a superscript G to indicate the school that we're talking about, ranging here from 1 to 3, where G is going to be the number of groups. And with this model, we have a few different analysis options. So the first option will be to pool all the data together and just compute a single estimate, just ignoring the differences. And this can be a good idea if we think that the differences between these schools are relatively small. But if they're actually different, we're going to be missing out on something. So a second option is to address these differences and introduce this into our model by having a different beta, different effect for each school, and then analyze these data independently. But in some situations, this could actually even make things worse, particularly if the data are noisy or small. The amount of like inferential error that this could introduce could be large. So the third option that I'll talk about of hierarchical modeling is kind of like interpolating between these two things to partially pool the data together to get an estimate that's kind of the best of both worlds. Okay, so in hierarchical Bayesian modeling, we have a few key ingredients that I'll quickly just go over. It's, again, building up notation here. So first is going to be the prior distribution. This is P beta. And the idea here is that this is going to capture our subjective prior beliefs about the parameters before we see the data. So a simple choice for this could be that for each school G, the effect beta G is normally distributed with mean mu and variance sigma beta. So saying that the parameter for each school is just scattered around some shared mean with a constant variance. And with this approach, our prior is kind of explicitly describing the similarity of the schools through this shared mu. Second ingredient is the likelihood. So this is relating the observed data to the unknown parameters and writing this as P of y given beta. And this comes directly from our assumed distribution on this residual epsilon. It tells us that conditionally on beta, each of the YGNs is distributed normally with mean given by this like effect if we're in the after school program, again with this variance sigma squared. Together, we can do posterior inference using Bayes' rule, which tells us how to update our prior beliefs based on our likelihood. And then a standard way to summarize this, particularly if we care about squared error loss, is using the posterior mean, which is just integrating over the posterior and taking this expectation of this coefficient beta g. And here, this again, the idea is that this will balance between our prior and likelihood, and allow us to share strength. And this, I'll mention, is the computational step. Right, computing integrals can be challenging, and that's what's going to require algorithms. So we'll see that later in the talk. Okay, a final piece that I'll talk about for background here is empirical Bayes, which is this idea of using the data to help choose our prior distribution. And the idea here is we want to allow the data from each group to influence our prior belief about the others. So one way that we can do this is by like maximum marginal likelihood. So choosing the parameters mu, sigma, beta, just to be the parameters that maximize this probability of y integrating over beta for the choices of those parameters. And while this is a super strange thing to see if you're not used to it, because now we're kind of operationalizing double dipping into our data, it's going to reduce our reliance on these subjective choices of parameters, and in the end can lead to quite effective estimates in many cases. Yeah, if there are any questions on that, feel free to interrupt. If not, I'll move on.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Shivam. I'm in the Smiley lab at MGH. But why would we use empirical Bayes? Like, are there instances where we might not want to use empirical Bayes as opposed to just a prior?
Yeah. So, like, for instances where you might not want to use empirical Bayes. Yeah. So, like in some cases, like you might actually have prior beliefs, kind of like up front, that you might explicitly want to use to describe like what you think about the data. So say I come into this analysis thinking that like the effect of an after school program is probably going to be improving year over year test scores. Right? I might want to in the beginning set mu to be something positive. And maybe I know something about the spread. So kind of like explicitly taking like a fully Bayesian approach rather than empirical Bayesian can allow you to do that. There are also some good theoretical reasons for doing this from the kind of like decision theory like side of statistics. Yeah, so these results that essentially say that like if you do something empirical Bayesian rather than say fixing your priors ahead of time, there's guaranteed to be some other estimation strategies that will give you more accurate estimates regardless of what the parameter you're trying to estimate is. So for those initiated into this, these are called like complete class theorems.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sweet. Okay, so now there's a last piece of notation that we have to build up in the situation, which is for handling multiple dimensions, so doing multiple linear regression. So here we're asking, what if we have multiple attributes of each student? So more than just whether or not they were in this after school program. So you can think participation in sports, maybe past academic performance or demographic information as well. And in this situation, right, we can expand our model to now have our response for each school and each student in each school as depending on a sum of effects, right, for each of these covariates, again, plus this same residual epsilon. And at this point, even though all the pieces are quite simple, we're getting into a lot of notation. So I'll just summarize this here. So there are these three sets of indices that we're going to need to use if we want to talk formally about hierarchical modeling. So there's this number of covariates, so say different student attributes that has just been introduced on this slide. There's the number of groups. So again, think these three different schools in Cambridge, Somerville, and in Dallas. And then there's also the number of samples that we have in each group, which for simplicity, to avoid even more notation, we can just assume that this is constant for each group. Though, I mean, in a paper that I'll give a reference to at the end, we certainly are handling this more general case. And in terms of what the parameter that we want to estimate is, right now, instead of having a vector of parameters for each school, now we have a big matrix, right, which I can write as having G columns, where each of the columns, right, has this superscript indicating which group it's associated with. And each of these columns is going to be a D vector of effects corresponding to each covariate. And the question here now is, what prior can we put on this matrix, right? So if we want to do hierarchical modeling, we need to use a prior. And in contrast to this simpler case, not in multiple regression, how to do this is a little bit unclear. So our method, which I gave this teaser for on the first slide, comes from a particular answer to this question, again, based on this assumption of a priori exchangeability of effects across covariates. But before getting into that, I'll give a last piece of background on this classical approach, which is assuming instead exchangeability of effects across groups. And our approach is going to build very closely off of this. All right. Yeah, so this classical approach, this dates back about 50 years now to the work of Leaming and Smith in 1972. And again, is starting with this assumption of a priori exchangeability across groups. And intuitively, really all this means is that if we separate our effects out into columns, right, so one vector corresponding to each group, that if we reorder these columns, this doesn't impact the prior probability of that parameter. So any kind of reordering here, right, doesn't, yeah, would seem just as reasonable. And the significance of this assumption is that this somewhat fundamental result of probability theory, De Finetti's theorem, then suggests a conditionally IID representation of a prior that must exist essentially under this assumption. And although De Finetti's theorem doesn't tell us exactly what the form of this prior should be, a particularly simple option is to use a multivariate Gaussian prior. So saying that for each of these D vectors beta G, this is a priori distributed from some normal with mean C and covariance gamma, right, where D is going to be a D vector, the mean for each of these covariates, and gamma is this D by D covariance matrix. And this is, and that the idea here is that gamma is now going to reflect the covariance of effects within each group. So maybe if the effect of the after school program is very high, in some school, maybe we would expect a smaller effect for associated with participation in sports. And essentially because of this simplicity and computational simplicity down the line, this is exactly what Leaming and Smith had done in their original paper, and has since become like extremely widely used in hierarchical modeling. So for example, in this software package for mixed modeling, LME4, all right, this prior structure based on this assumption of exchangeability across groups is used by default. And this package has been downloaded like over 15 million times. So it's kind of everywhere in this statistical modeling world. But this approach has some pretty serious limitations in certain settings. So the first one is expressivity. So this exchangeability across groups assumption kind of explicitly requires that we're describing each group as a priori equally similar to one another. So it doesn't now accommodate the possibility of saying that we think maybe Cambridge and Somerville could be more similar to one another than they are to Dallas. Additionally, in high dimensions, we run into some practical problems where the size of this prior parameter that yeah, we're going to try to estimate by empirical Bayes. For example, this is how LME4 does it. And this widely used implementation is going to require on the order of d squared parameters. So by high dimensions, again, I'm considering the situation where d, the number of covariates, is greater than g, the number of groups. And this is really going to be a tall order, both from kind of an inferential perspective of can we get a good estimate of this matrix, and then also computationally. And limits our options for how we can explore this space. So by contrast, as many of you are possibly anticipating at this point already, our approach that we suggest for high dimensional problems is to instead think of treating the effects as exchangeable by covariate rather than by group. So by analogy, we're going to be separating, right, the entries of this matrix by row into these beta Ds. And this assumption is that, right, if we have a setting of these parameters, if we permuted now the rows, any permutation of the rows would seem just as reasonable. And in many high dimensional settings, so for example, if you consider this context in statistical genetics, where each of these D covariates might be describing a different SNP, we might not have that much prior information going in about how like SNPs are differently related from one another. So this assumption can be quite natural. And by complete analogy, we then suggest modeling for each covariate D, ranging from 1 to the total number of covariates, big D, modeling each of the beta Ds as distributed a priori IID from the normal with mean mu and variance sigma, where now mu is going to be a G vector of means, and sigma is this G by G covariance matrix. And here now, sigma is able to capture this relatedness between groups. So for example, we could have a large positive off-diagonal entry telling us that in general, the effects in the school in Cambridge are similar to the effects in the school in Somerville.
Do you take an empirical approach to learning sigma as well?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I'll get to that in a couple slides, a few slides.
Great.
And yeah, in particular for this empirical based step, this fact that now we're only dealing with on the order of G squared prior parameters is extremely useful. So now this is going to be, in addition to maybe a more natural prior, it's also going to be easier to infer with good precision. And although this is really conceptually similar to this classical approach, it leads to an estimator that has really fundamentally different properties, as we'll soon see, which I think is quite neat. And surprisingly, prior work on using this sort of exchangeability of effects across covariates is pretty sparse. So I'd say kind of maybe a counterexample to this is in the setting of just a single group. And this may help for intuition as well. Yeah, when G is equal to 1, in the special case that mu is then equal to 0, this approach, when we get the posterior mean, is going to exactly coincide with like a ridge regression estimate. And the slim work available, that we found that does discuss this sort of exchangeability across covariates. Are these two papers from the 80s that take this perspective, ridge regression a little bit farther, and kind of arrive on at similar things, asking how can you extend ridge regression to this multiple data set setting. But in contrast to all prior work, and what's remaining, right? We haven't finished just because we proposed a model. We provide kind of general inference procedures, including this empirical based step, and also some evidence for efficacy in this high dimensional setting, both in terms of theory and empirics. And I'll get into inference soon, But I wanted to pause to give this aside on connections to statistical genetics and this idea of genetic correlation. And this kind of previous work has come from questions basically around like to what extent are correlations between different traits explained by similar underlying genetics. So a lot of ink has been spilled in particular on this question of, is there a shared genetic basis between like creativity and madness, in particular bipolar disorder. So famous examples being like Ernest Hemingway and Virginia Woolf, but also more recently Kanye West and Robin Williams. And yeah, in statistical genetics, right, we build kind of formal frameworks to think about answering questions like this. And as with much in statistical genetics, the way that we formally address this is going to be with the linear model. And in fact, the same linear model that I was showing on the last slide, or on a previous slide, but we're now, Y is going to be describing the phenotypes that we observe. X is going to be genotypes, beta is SNP effects, and epsilon is going to be this environmental kind of residual term. And hopefully I don't offend those who really are experts in statistical genetics here by this gross approximation of genetic correlation. But the idea here essentially is that we might decompose what we see in terms of phenotypic correlation, so say between two traits of creativity and bipolar disorder, as under some assumptions, in particular like independence between between genetics and environment and things being like generally small. This decomposes into a genetic correlation component and an environmental correlation component. And this idea of genetic correlation, this shared genetic component to trait correlation, has been used in a number of different applications across statistical genetics. So for quantifying like pleiotropy, right? So this is precisely this idea of the same genes impacting multiple different traits, as well as increasing power for association mapping and risk prediction. And from a Bayesian perspective, for example, in this prior work by Bullock Sullivan and Hillary, we can describe genetic correlation as just being the correlation between the effects for different traits, again, from this Bayesian perspective, where we treat these parameters beta as random. So now if we have this prior where beta is distributed from a normal with mean 0 and covariance sigma, genetic correlation is just between two traits is just exactly this relatedness that I talked about before after some rescaling. So after seeing like Hillary and some others work using this like concept and particularly this Bayesian model, it really felt like this should be everywhere, at least in high dimensional settings. But surprisingly, it's really not. It doesn't seem to have made it outside of genetics.
Ryan, can I bother you about this equation? I get that this is maybe just sort of heuristic. Somehow the normalizations are bothering me that you're adding correlations and getting a correlation. Should it really be that, or is it are they really covariances, or should I not be taking it so literally? Or
don't take it so literally, basically. Yeah. So if you wanted to decompose the covariance under an independence assumption, you could get covariance decomposing into the sum of two covariances. Yeah, in correlation space, this equation is definitely wrong.
Okay, fine. I was thinking covariances, so okay, fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. So I'll would also so kind of interesting thing is that we think that the origin of this idea of genetic correlation and how it's become used in all these different applications outside that within genetics has served as a roadblock to its generalization beyond genetics. So in particular, these approaches really became developed in this literature on cattle breeding using mixed effect models for cattle breeding, where the traits that we might be considering could be for like a bull that you're for like cows and bulls that you're breeding. You might want to know how the genetics for how big it's going to grow and how docile it is are related. But this idea of genetic correlation traces back much further, at least as early as this paper by Hazel in 1943, which actually predates the understanding of nucleic acid as a genetic material a year later. So this idea has come entirely out of this pre-DNA world, where we had no idea even like what reasonable covariates would be in the context of a linear model for these things. So against this background of prior work in statistical genetics, what we're providing is essentially this alternative statistical justification via exchangeability, efficient general inference algorithms, and then also some theoretical and empirical support for use beyond genetics. All right, so two pieces left remaining in this talk. So I've introduced a model and told you how it relates to some of this prior work in genetics. But we can't use this until we have inference algorithms, like a way of actually getting an estimate of the effects. So I'll go into that next. Okay, so recapping our multifaceted notation. So we have this matrix of effects beta. There are d covariates, each with an effect for each group. And we have n data points per group. Pieces of our model, we have this prior saying that each of the rows of this matrix are coming IID from a normal with, for simplicity to reduce some complexities in algebra. For now, I'll assume that the mean of this is 0, though in our paper, we handled the more general case. And then as our likelihood, again, we have this Gaussian observation model, where each y is coming from a normal with mean x beta and variance sigma squared. And together, Bayes' rule gives us the posterior, and we're going to try to estimate beta by its posterior mean. And in general, this step of posterior inference can be like very computationally challenging. But as a result of like this particular choice of a Gaussian prior, I mentioned computational tractability as a motivation for that choice. This is exactly where that comes in. Conjugacy between this Gaussian prior and Gaussian likelihood are going to give us a closed form expression for this posterior mean. And what this means is that we're going to get away from having to use things like Markov chain Monte Carlo or empirical Bayes. I should also say explicitly, I'm going to denote the estimate coming from this approach by this beta hat eco for exchangeability of effects among across covariates. Okay, but how do we actually use conjugacy in this setting? So this is a bit tricky because the thing that we're estimating again is a matrix. But our approach is going to be turn this just into a vector estimation problem. So we can kind of unroll this matrix and stack the vectors of effects for each group into one long big matrix of size GD. And then now we're in a setting where kind of like the standard tools for Bayesian linear regression apply, and we can just chug through and applying this linear algebra to get an estimate out. So you can find this in your favorite machine learning or like statistics textbook. For example, in Bishop, provides an equation that lets us get here. There is a catch though, which is that these matrix multiplies, although we have them in closed form and we don't need to approximate this integral, this can be super high dimensional, right? So if D is large and we have many groups, right now this matrix is going to be G times larger than it was if we just had a single problem. So we have this high dimensional linear system that we need to solve in order to get these estimates. But we show that in our paper that this problem is actually tractable using a conjugate gradient algorithm. So actually in the context of working with Nathan and Hillary and Ellie on gene prioritization, we showed that you can scale this approach to get estimates in systems up to 1 million parameters in just minutes on a fairly standard machine.
So am I right that if you stare at this equation, you can see the reduction to the ridge regression case when the number of groups is 1? Is that?
Yes. So in that case, right, so these IDs I should have explained are so these identity matrices of size D, so just ones on the diagonal, zeros everywhere else. So in the G equals 1 case, right, we just have the first entry here. All of these are going to be non-existent. And then the sigma 1, is just directly going to be equivalent to like 1 over lambda, basically in your ridge regression. It's appropriately scaled by this variance sigma. There are also a lot of other neat things that come out when you spend a lot of time staring at this equation. So I mean, you can also see how if you shift things around a little bit, you can see each of the estimated effects like for each group as kind of like a weighted average of like the least squares estimates for each of the other groups, where the weights are essentially determined by this covariates matrix sigma. But getting to the bottom of that is like a bit too much for a talk. But on that point, we're not actually going to be able to use this approach and do this kind of intelligent weighted average until we know what this matrix sigma is. To Alex's earlier question about using empirical Bayes, this is exactly what we do. Like we have to choose this matrix. Unless there are other thoughts or questions on this slide, I'll move on to that. Cool. Yeah, so as I mentioned, right, this matrix sigma is what represents this relatedness between groups. And since in many settings we don't have a great sense of what that should be a priori, we're proposing to learn this by empirical Bayes, in particular using this maximum marginal likelihood approach. Here we run into a challenge that, in contrast to the posterior mean, the solution to this optimization problem is not computable analytically. So we don't have a closed form expression for this. To address this challenge, we've developed an expectation maximization algorithm that efficiently finds this matrix that solves this optimization problem. So for those who are familiar with expectation maximization, in this case, the unknown parameters beta are playing the role of the missing data. So in analogy to using expectation maximization for clustering, right, this is taking the place of the unknown cluster assignments of points into the groups in your clustering. And for implementing this EM algorithm, right, we have 2 steps. Just super briefly, or in this expectation step, we're looking at the posterior covariance for each of the beta Ds, given our current guess of what this matrix is and conditioned on the data as well. And then in the M step, the maximization step, we update sigma to match this estimated expected covariance and repeat this over and over again until we converge. Although I don't have time to get into it in this talk, in our paper we show that this EM algorithm gives better estimates than you could get if you instead of maximizing conditioned on all of the data. We're only looking at pairs of groups independently. Okay, so some might be skeptical of this empirical Bayes step. And to get a kind of more precise grip on how well this approach works, even with this step, we're going to take a closer look at our approach in terms of risk, first from a frequentist perspective. So specifically, even though we're talking about estimators defined from a Bayesian perspective, since our prior is a function of the data, we can reasonably ask how well it does on average for any fixed value of the parameter. And for this problem, we look at squared error risk, right? So this is just the expected value of the squared error summing over all the parameters over different realizations of the data sets Y. And considering this risk, we have what's known as a domination result, which tells us that in the high dimensional setting, right, specifically when D is greater than 2G plus 2. So again, many more covariates than groups. And if the covariates for each group are uncorrelated, then regardless of what beta is, our approach, which again denoting as eCov, is going to have smaller squared error risk than least squares. Yeah, and interestingly, right, this is something that will hold for any beta, regardless of regardless of how well this prior based on exchangeability reflects our prior beliefs. And then furthermore, this classical approach in high dimensions is actually going to perform poorly relative to least squares in this high dimensional setting. And I'm denoting this by E group for assuming exchangeability across groups. Another piece of kind of theoretical validation that we've developed is looking into the extent of strength sharing between groups. So kind of a limitation of this sort of domination result is that it only tells us that the risk of one thing is smaller than the risk of another thing, and it doesn't tell us how large that gap is. And in general, that should depend on the parameters. So yeah, to kind of get a more precise handle on this, if we look at this covariance matrix, or a true covariance matrix of the effects, which I'll write as sigma star, so kind of like averaging across all the covariates and looking at this G by G matrix, like we see that like when the off-diagonal entries of this matrix in the beta are small, like independent estimates are going to be just as accurate. And we also show that in the case where they're large, through looking at essentially the eigenvalues of this matrix and comparing it to diagonal entries, that this gap can be large. Okay, so last piece that I'll share are some results on in simulation, and then on real data sets as well. And for the simulation setup, we're going to look at data sets consisting of 10 groups of data, each with 1,000 data points across different dimensionalities. So looking at from having only a single covariate up to about 300 covariates. And for each of these different dimensionalities, we're going to sample a bunch of like parameters, then generate data from our likelihood conditioned on these parameters, and see how the error of different estimators compares. And we're going to do this simulation in two different ways. So the first one is with effects actually correlated across across groups. So this is kind of assuming that our data is coming directly from our presumed generative model with high correlation. And in this setting, right, we see, as I showed on that first slide, that independent analyses that in this case, this is corresponding to applying our method just on each data set independently on the case of G equals 1. So again, this is what essentially is ridge regression that performs mostly uniformly as a function of dimension. And by contrast, the standard approach, exchangeability across groups, has this poor performance in high dimensions, and yeah, essentially balloons up as we get higher and higher. Whereas our approach, again, isn't performing so well in the low dimensional setting, but surpasses independent analyses as we do better, as dimensionality gets higher. But of course, we should expect things to perform well when the data are actually coming from this model with like effects correlated as we'd assumed. So the second check is seeing how things go when we have effects that are independent. So here now, instead of having these beta Ds coming from a correlated Gaussian, we're having them come from a Gaussian with this identity covariance matrix. And here we see that we still have the same exact trend moving from low dimensions to high dimensions relative to when we compare this exchangeability across covariates versus across groups. But as kind of predicted by our theory, we don't get this improvement over independent estimates in this case, because there's no sharing, there's no similarity to be capitalized on. So
if I can, so on this slide, so I thought that you were working in the regime where n was smaller than d, but here you're showing a simulation in the opposite regime.
Yeah. So for all the results that I've talked about, it's in this case, yes, and is larger than d. We've played a little bit around with this case where n is smaller than d, which particularly like the statistical genetic settings is like super relevant, super important. But yeah, things are a little bit trickier there, and some of like the theoretical results from the previous slide, we certainly don't know how to work out, and we're not sure if they hold. But I think that this is like a very interesting like open research direction of how to apply and formally think about hierarchical methods in this high dimensional d greater than n setting.
Cool. And just one more question is the beta that you find, are those unimodal distributed, or are they again, I mean, the expectation would be that most beta should be 0 and few beta should be large, but does your model achieve something like that by model result, or is mostly unimodal?
Yeah, I would say unimodal. So thinking about settings with sparsity as well, right? Which certainly we expect in a lot of settings, though certainly not all. I think is another like really, I think, interesting direction for future work.
All right, thank you.
Great. Yeah. So in these last couple of minutes, I'll just share some results on real data sets, and kind of in most of what we've talked about so far, really been talking about error in estimating the parameter in these regressions. But in real data sets, right, we don't have access to this true parameter. So we're going to use prediction performance on held out data as a proxy for estimation. So in these experiments, right, we are going to evaluate mean squared error with 5-fold cross-validation. Okay, so do this on 3 data sets that I'll show. So the first is this example of using linear models to relate community level rates of community level law enforcement with different like mostly demographic attributes of these communities, with communities split across 4 different regions of the country. So the East, West, like South and Midwest. And again, in agreement with our theory, we see that our approach is providing smaller prediction error than both this kind of standard exchangeability across groups approach pooling the data together, doing things independently. We're doing this regression style independent Bayesian analysis. And we see a similar effect on the second application, where we are relating different attributes of blog posts to reader engagement with those blog posts, as like measured with a proxy, the number of comments on the posts. And we do this with data and posts split across 3 different corpuses. And again, the story is basically the same, although the ordering of which other estimates are performing well is variable, right? So again, it's kind of important to note that depending on the application, right, what works well between like pooling or not pooling can differ. And then finally, even farther afield, we looked at an application to like transfer learning with image classification. So in another piece that I haven't talked about at all, we've extended this to do logistic regression for classification as well, right, where we still have like a generalized linear model. And here we can look at pairs of classification tasks between, in this case, just binary classifications and between different pairs of the 10 image types in this CFAR 10 data set. And say, can we improve our classification accuracy by sharing strength across these different pairs. And as a feature here, as our features here, we actually use like pre-trained neural network embeddings learned with a variational autoencoder. And again, see the same trend where our method is performing the best. The main takeaway here is that really across a pretty diverse set of applications, where the dimensionality is greater than from the number of groups, this approach, assuming exchangeability of effects across covariates, can improve predictions. So I'll just close again, highlighting these 2 main points, that this classical approach of exchangeability across groups can perform really poorly in high dimensions, but by contrast, our approach can improve upon independent pooled estimates in this high dimensional setting. This work is in a paper that's appearing in NeurIPS in, I guess, a couple weeks now. So if you're interested in learning more, definitely take a look at that, or feel free to reach out to me. I'd be super happy to work with folks that are maybe interested in using these methods in a problem that they're working on. So please reach out to me if this sounds interesting.